Welcome guys, this is Gamers, Devs and Scholars. I'm your host, Javier, and joining me today are...
Ava.
And Ladyem.
Bobcat. Jonas.
It is somewhat of a suspense to see if the mics maybe are working, the audio, the order. But yeah, we're all here. And we are commenting today the second part of Paradise Killer. The first time it was our initial impressions. Many of you have already completed the game or even made a review of the game, but this time persons like us who play slower, who have no time, finally caught up more or less with you experts. So maybe we can begin by having this question. What was more surprising to you guys about this game now that you have completed it? Or at least found one of the endings?
Well, I guess I have only gotten one ending, but I guess that there doesn't seem to be a one big final ending really, and I don't feel like I've gotten like one big fat answer out of it. It's more like I did something and now I'm just kind of sitting and thinking about it. Yeah.
Ava was just mentioning that there is in fact apparently a complete, or how do you call it, Ava? Like a major ending?
There's a true ending.
Okay. I did not expect that, by the way.
Yeah. Something that I found kind of interesting is that I actually ran out of crimes to pin on the guilty parties during one of my playthroughs. I only figured this out during a subsequent playthrough where what I decided to do is certain facts only come out if you accuse certain people. And so after doing what I thought was the true ending, I decided to just start accusing everyone of different things to see what would come out. Kind of brute forcing it a little bit, but it wound up uncovering a few additional parts of one of the conspiracies, which was kind of interesting that I didn't actually uncover at the time.
Wow.
And one other interesting thing is that it leaves up in the air who actually committed the murder.
For you, in what you played. Okay.
Yeah. So, for example, I had an ending where you have two different options. You have the person who is probably the most the biggest suspect, who gets caught with blood on their hands. They have a perfect knife, which goes along with the evidence there. But then you also have a demon, which has perfect claws and which can cause these same sort of slash wounds. And depending on which conspiracy you lean more into, you can wind up pinning it on one or the other person, but you can't pin it on both. And so you have to make those kinds of decisions. And I thought that was really sort of cool, because the game doesn't actually necessarily make it clear which is the correct answer. And so it was a really cool thing where I don't know that there necessarily is a true ending, in the sense that you don't have enough evidence to actually determine who was at fault.
Fascinating.
I actually had some thoughts as well. One of them being that the punishments in this are extreme. Like even if you did like the smallest thing, like, oh well, time to get murdered. So that was intense. But my thought was also that they had started moving people to the new island or whatever it was before all this went down. I was like, there's probably people on that new one that are completely involved in this conspiracy that got completely off because they made it out before everything locked down. And so I came out of it thinking, like, this isn't going to be over because there's still people involved with this.
Indeed. And something useful for that could be these flash forwards that we have of the next island, the next sequence. We sometimes get the conversations at the bar, and at least with my playthrough, that did give me the impression that some things are not fulfilled like you were suggesting, because there is a question: was the crime completely solved? And one of the bar attendees would say, like, "Oh, we'll see."
And I mean, in the game, you have two different competing conspiracies. And if you've already got two different competing conspiracies, which would have required more people to actually enact, then there's no telling how many more there were out there. There are only two characters I was able to find that were, I believe, to be innocent. And even one of them that had a question over it. Out of all of the characters in the game, everyone else was involved.
This is innocent, obviously.
Yeah, I had two that I thought were innocent, and then there were two that I kind of let off because I thought that they didn't deserve to be murdered.
Yeah.
By the way, you can spoil it completely. Remember, this is the full spoilery version of events, if you want to describe who they are.
So the only two I couldn't pin anything on were Crimson Acid and Dr. Doomjazz. I wound up going through the trial, again, numerous times, just kind of accusing people and messing around to see if there was something that I had missed. Dr. Doomjazz had some motive and could potentially have been complicit in getting the blood of one of the council members to get someone in the chamber. That was the most I could possibly pin on him, and even that was iffy. And then Crimson Acid, I couldn't really pin anything on.
Okay, because on my end, I did execute her.
Murder.
I did execute Acid. It was not my intention, but what I could pin on her, even though I'm pretty sure that there are gaps, is that she could have murdered KHX, the one in the workshop. I know that she wasn't, or that there are gaps, but she was heavily involved in what happened to him.
So, yeah, and that was one that I found out my first time through, but I only found out after accusing Yuri of it. Yuri winds up confessing completely to that. He bashed his head in and threw him over the cliff. And so it was one of those things where I was like, I don't actually want to accuse Acid, because because I like this character. And so I was like, I'll go with Yuri, because this is the only other person with a motive and who had evidence right there. And all of a sudden he spills everything.
Yeah, and it's interesting because those are the two that are romanceable in the game. You can romance Crimson Acid and you can romance Dr. Doomjazz. So the two that you can actually have relations with are the two that are the hardest to pin something on.
Yeah, which made me suspect. That was part of why I kind of went back and did it.
Doomjazz had me with that reaction, like you described. Since he is very forward and I like you, I'm like, oh, but I am the detective here. I did like the guy a lot, but that gave me some suspicious. That eventually there are some interesting events. Maybe I can describe what was more interesting to me. So many stories say that, so many writers suggest that in your stories you should show, don't tell. And in this game, it has so much that is the opposite. It is somewhat static, this game. You usually have the characters just standing there and talking. However, with those conversations, it is enough for you to know so much about what happened across millennia, which would be almost impossible in any visual way to actually live so many events that are described. So I believe it definitely works. I actually recalled the text that you suggested, Anne, about how games can particularly make us feel. She suggested by Catherine Isbister, Emotion by Design. And something very quickly that I believe resonated with me is that she describes that avatars help us to more easily feel what the characters may be experiencing. So this game, as you have seen, has these characters that are so fully well developed. Even if they may be static, even if they don't have 3D models, they are sprites most of the time. Their motives, their backstories, how they are linked in between and have conspiracies inside their conspiracies was enough for me to feel for so many of them. Even if mechanically it was so light, you know, at least for me, I didn't need more. I didn't need for events to be shown. I just needed the avatars to have such strong motivations that they would, for me, make this conspiracy feel quite complex, even if, as I said, we didn't see that much happening in the game.
Well, like, I mean, coming from a writing background, I object in general to when people just apply one of those rules across the board. Show don't tell absolutely has its place, but generally speaking with games, that place is whenever you are an agent in the story of what's going on. In an investigative game, you're not. What you're doing is you're putting together what happened before. And so in a situation like that, part of the point of the game is that you're not being shown. You have to decipher that from what's around you. And so, yeah, I think that it's an interesting, and I think it's completely valid idea to have, as long as it's done well. And in this game, I like the fact that, again, there is no real true ending. There is no necessarily definite sequence of events that happens. And that's a major theme throughout the game, is the idea of you're not necessarily putting together the singular truth. You're putting together
your truth.
Yeah, your truth through the facts that you've gathered.
Totally.
Did anybody try to exile anybody or execute anybody after the trials?
Did you, Jonas?
I probably like you guys. I didn't pin any. I didn't accuse Lydia or Sam, but I really want. Yeah, but at the end, I really want to just go up there and like, I know you're up to something.
So you needed another option that was missing.
Yeah. If I could have exiled those two together, I would probably have done that. That would have been nice, just because I think they want to run away or something like that. So,
yeah, that's their motive. They want to leave the syndicate.
Yeah.
Indeed. By the way, you haven't mentioned, was there something that surprised you the most after you had at least one ending?
I actually unlocked 2 conspiracies in my playthrough, to the point it almost linked up. I think both the Killer Demon and Dominate both did it.
Is that the secret character? I wasn't able to unlock him.
Yeah, he's high up.
Yeah.
Jonas reacts just like I did.
It's a murder mystery. It's going to be a secret character involved.
Right, yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and like I said, I don't know that I necessarily think that both of them did it. I don't think that there's enough evidence that there were 2 killers. And like there's evidence that he was sort of thwarted, but there's also evidence that the demon was, like, at the end of the day, you have 2 people who have motive, they have the same type of murder weapon, and both of them wound up with bullets in them. The difference was that the demon wound up dying immediately. And in fact, in my first playthrough, the killer demon was also one of the people who didn't get prosecuted, which felt weird.
It's like innocent or like something like that. I'm like, wait a minute, you.
That's a strong word, but yeah, okay.
I believe that.
Me too.
A fight for demon rights.
I believe that there are cases of that, but I was still surprised that I could prosecute the demon who is already dead. I did get him as guilty, and I'm like, and what's going to happen with him? But yeah, in I don't know, judicial processes, there have been cases of prosecuting even dead popes that have been, what's the opposite of bury? Like uncovered again? They had this pope had already been buried because he was dead, and his successor dug him up so that he would be on a trial, found accused, and then I don't know what happened to him. He had some
they
kind
exhumed
of
him.
Exhume, that's the verb in English. Yeah. So it would make sense that for a demon you could also judge him even if he's already dead. That happened on my ending.
So usually I when there's like a type of game or maybe a movie where it's like, oh, you gotta find your own truth or your own meaning and so on and so on. I often just think, oh, this is just lazy, right? Because you just didn't want to say anything meaningful or whatever. But actually, I found myself being a bit, I don't know, like maybe a bit scared of myself in a way, because I ended up with pinning maybe a bit too much on Yuri, and I knew that like he wasn't probably responsible for all the things that I was pinning on him, but the people that I was accusing was going to die, right? So I was like, you know, I was almost creating a scapegoat, sort of for my own convenience, I guess, or just to sort of impacting the overall like the consequences of the trial. So that just sort of happened really naturally, and it just kind of almost scared me a little bit. Yeah.
It scared you how easy it was to accuse Yuri.
Yeah. No. Well. No. Cause, okay. Man, no. Not Yuri in particular, but not just how I found it really convenient to scapegoat Yuri. So I was just no longer like looking for the truth. I was like, you know, this person is going to die, so let's just pin some more. Because his family probably did something wrong, right? But I sort of just
Yuri did everything.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that like I didn't really discover until I went back and did the trial again was I kind of mentioned this in the first video. I thought that initially you had your kind of good characters and your bad characters. I thought that was how they were going to handle it. Like my first thought was everybody's probably guilty of something, but then I was like, okay, well, even in the trial you have Carmelina, Witness, Yuri, and I can't remember who the other person is, over on one side of the courtroom. And then you have Dr. Doom, Jazz, Lydia, Sam, and Crimson Acid over on the other side.
Oh, Witness to the end.
Witness to the end.
And so initially I was just like, oh, well, it felt less fun almost for a moment, because I thought, oh, okay, well, I'm going to convict all the people on this side of the room. I'm not going to convict all the people on that side of the room. And then it was later on, whenever it was like, oh, Lydia and Sammy actually did really figure into this and could possibly have been, you know, responsible for getting the demon involved. And that was kind of where the game sort of opened up for me and became a lot more interesting. Because, yeah, it wound up subverting my expectations twice. And I only discovered it by messing around with the game. You know?
Lydia and Sam are characters that you so easily feel for them, and that is something that maybe was added so that you could have this surprise. You at first impression would not suspect of them. For example, myself, I know that they want to get out of the island. I did find the lyrics of the song that they apparently wrote together, but I wasn't able to link them to the demon like you described. Now that I am learning this, I can understand there is a motivation. I only miss one link, but I prefer to have these kinds of characters. Yuri, on the other hand, like Jonas described, was someone who could immediately feel guilty for me. So if I have these two kinds of characters, the ones that are so likable yet have something dark that I have to dig out with a lot of effort, and Yuri, who is naturally someone who participated in the conspiracy but who is a bit of a red herring for me, since very easily I detected, oh, this guy has something dark in between. I didn't want to easily end the game. I really wanted to try to find something, another angle, because it was too simplistic for me for Yuri to be the only one involved.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about Yuri is that, like, if he did it, he straight up admits it. If you accuse him, he's like, yeah, I did that. Like, all right. And yeah, and the thing that I think is interesting, and especially bringing up the book that I recommended, she even talks about, like, NPCs at one point and how they can help build a sense of feeling and empathy. And in this game, even knowing that Sam and Lydia were involved, I empathized with them so much, and I liked them so much. So I was like, I'm just going to purposefully ignore anything that you actually did and just not bring it up.
Wow.
Yeah, like I completely just ignored anything that would point towards them, just because I didn't want them to die for what they did. I thought that they didn't deserve that.
That's so impressive.
I like that the game kind of appeals to your own sense of justice. There are arguments to be made for justifying the murder even. And there are arguments to be made for each individual character. Probably Yuri the least, but that may just be personal bias. But like, you know, Carmelina, she is the leader of the syndicate, at least for the time being. And even though she is very deeply involved with what happened and was planning it and orchestrated this whole conspiracy, you have, as you hang out with her and as you talk with her, you have the ability to kind of get her side of things and find things out. And, you know, with Witness to the End, it's kind of the same thing. Like you start to realize all of the different nuances of why. And in some cases, you don't realize it until after the trial is over. But I like that you have the option of who to prosecute and who not to. And there's enough evidence to convict virtually anybody. I also found out that it doesn't really matter how much evidence you have because the judge will just go along with it anyway. But yeah.
In that sense, go ahead.
I was going to say one thing that I did find really upsetting, and I'm blanking on his name, the guy who was accused of everything to begin with.
Oh,
Henry
Division.
Yeah, so no matter what happens, like in mine, Henry got off of everything. Like he didn't do any of it. But he still is doomed because he's still a person on this island and they're going to leave him behind. And so that's really upsetting to me. It was a hard thing for me to live with when I was finishing the game. Like he didn't actually do any of this. He's been accused of this. He's had his life ruined because of the syndicate. And he just is going to be here and die for nothing.
Like Bobcat described, this game with these kinds of impossible situations confronts us with what is justice for each of us. I enjoy that there is no easy exit. In the case of Henry, from the very beginning, I appreciated that there was this easy scapegoat, because that invited me, at least for me, to see him as someone probably too convenient and even possibly innocent. Eventually, I did realize that he did murder people, but in the past, for another crime, and with very complex circumstances surrounding it. So I appreciate that in this game, and we're going to link it next to what maybe we did not enjoy most about this game. But what I appreciate about this complexity is that I see how non-binary justice is. There is no one good solution. There are only multiple potential strategies and precedents that we are settling. I would love to see if probably there is something about that in a follow-up game, because there should be some kind of repercussions about what happened in this island in comparison with the coming island. Supposedly all of these islands have had some kind of repercussion, and I wonder if the justice precedent that we settled will have that kind of impact.
But after 24 items, they finally save a god.
Yeah, I think I was less conflicted with Henry because of the fact that he wasn't just a complete scapegoat. Like, he was still a convicted criminal who was in the desolation cell for crimes that he had committed, and I could empathize with his circumstances. Like, I like that they wrote him as a very human character. At the same time, like, I don't think I was particularly conflicted about him getting left behind, because even though he didn't commit this crime, he had committed multiple other crimes for which he would have been, you know, exiled or killed or what have you. And so I think that was a little bit less of an issue for me.
But like morally, I had an issue with it because one, they're essentially kidnapping these citizens and bringing them in and making them worship their gods. So like, one, you have that moral conflict of what they're doing to begin with is inherently a wrong thing. And then also you have the fact that he ended up having this turn because of Yuri in the first place, that you know, he was convenient for them in every sense of the word, that they could just kidnap him, make him do whatever they want. And then when they want something done that is brutal and awful, they're like, well, time for you to do it. Have fun. And so like he's a pawn. He's kind of a puppet for them. And it's really upsetting.
From the get-go, this society is flawed, has deeply terrible actions. And there is a phenomenon related to this about when the scale of evil is so twisted, you start losing the perspective on what doesn't seem that much of a crime, because already so many terrible things have happened in a society. I enjoy that this society has this terrible background, yet as a player you are not so burdened with it, because visually, with the assets that we do experience, you never see any of that terrible degree of suffering. You have to allocate that more rationally, and it does, I believe, have an impact in eventually the decisions that you do. So it is a fine balance. It is a balance somewhat difficult to achieve. If any of the terrible tragedies, I don't know, a kidnapping, if that were actually shown in the game, you would have a completely different atmosphere to this funny paradise with some romance involved.
It's also why I really like Shinji as a character. He gets demonized the entire way through, despite the fact that he is very much the player avatar in many ways. He's the one who points out, hey, this is really messed up. The fact that you're bringing all these people onto this island, killing them in the name of your gods and things like that. And I like that the game takes this person who is making these rational points and, well, quite literally demonizes them and makes them, this antagonistic character, because it almost makes you forget. It makes you sort of calibrate your sense of justice a little bit, where it's like, I'm just here to solve this murder for the Syndicate. All that other stuff is kind of above my pay grade. And then you start thinking about it and you're like, oh no, wait, actually, this is all really messed up. And even the most sympathetic of characters is complicit in all of this stuff going on,
So there was
he's a very good Greek chorus.
Yes.
He was. So there was not even one character who was somewhat innocent from the actual murdering of the Syndicate, of the Council.
Well,
everyone more or less participated in some way.
That was the whole point of the Syndicate, was they were going to bring their gods and they were going to give them, tribute and praise. They were going to have their citizens praising the gods, and then they execute the citizens whenever demons would show up on the island. So yeah, everybody was complicit and everybody was benefiting off of what was going on.
But my question is about the Montserrat and the actual heads of the Syndicate who were murdered. Was everyone of the accused somewhat involved in the conspiracy, or was there at least one character who did not participate?
In the conspiracy, particularly, the only two that I couldn't pin anything hard on were Dr. Doomjazz and Crimson. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even Doomjazz, again, there was a question mark over Doomjazz.
Okay.
So yeah. I think they're fingers in the pies. It's just a matter of how deep in your hand is to that pie. And he's basically got like a pinky tip, and Crimson Jazz has the pinky tip, and everybody else is just like, well, let me put my whole hand in this. Just get all that pie.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So another question I believe that would benefit from all of us is, was there something that for you could be improved about this game? If anything were possible in order to make it perfect, specifically for each of you, what would you enjoy for, let's say, another game in this series?
Mine was not really involved in murder mystery. I found the save points too cluster.
Okay.
Like you can just walk a couple feet and you run into a narrow save point.
Yeah. In terms of level design, they were sometimes not that useful, right? With their location. convenient, maybe.
I mean, I've already mentioned the issues that I had with the map. That was a big thing for me. And narratively, there were some odd moments. Like, there's this whole mention of vampires at one point, but then like you don't do anything with that other than help out like an NPC ghost man. And I'm like, what is this about? Why are there vampires? I need some kind of explanation on this, but it's just nothing.
It distracted you. You felt like a distraction.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What about for you guys?
One of the issues I had was the fast travel system. I was okay with the system that they had. That was fine, but it felt like the map was designed in such a way that it almost was encouraging me to use blood crystals to fast travel in some situations, especially whenever I kept having to go out to the desolation cell. I was like, I'm having to walk down this bridge for like 10 minutes. I don't know. It's something ridiculous. The island was made, I think, intentionally difficult to traverse in order to make it feel like a bigger environment. But what that meant was that I was encouraged to use these blood crystals I was trying to save to actually get relics or to, pay off Crimson Acid for information or something like that in order to just engage in basic movement.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Was there something for you, Jonas, that maybe could have been improved?
Well, I'm not sure if so there's one thing where I feel like the game is very as long as you have the map markers and such, you always have like somewhere to go, sort of. But there was a point in the game where I was just like, okay, fuck it, I'm gonna get every crystal and every marker, let's do it.
Yep.
And then maybe some hours pass, and then I'm already sort of. Maybe those markers led me to important clues for the trials, but I maybe missed like one or two. I missed going into Witness's apartment. So, and like small things like that, and those things aren't marked, and it's really easy to sort of forget. I guess I could just check the case notes, but I'm really lazy. Okay, so
yes, so, like last week or the last time we talked, I was asking about Eyes Kiwami, and Bobcat, you had mentioned something about like being able to figure out the cause of death, but none of that was in my case notes, and I didn't remember to go back to the cemetery. So it's not always necessarily going to be there to remember, like, hey, you should probably go back to this computer. So I wouldn't completely blame yourself on that, Jonas.
Oh, no, yeah. Something I will say that does help with that is getting the meditation power. Mm-hmm. That points out not just collectibles, but also key facts in the case, which is something I was also kind of conflicted about. It's something, it only costs like 5 blood crystals. It pays for itself. There's no reason not to get it because you're going to make back all those blood crystals just by the fact they're revealed on the map. But I wasn't sure how I felt about it revealing pieces of evidence because all of a sudden I could just kind of hold Y to advance the story sometimes or whatever the key was.
Was it too easy for you to get that skill?
Yeah, well, because I figured out the foot baths, I just kind of took a chance on one of them. I was just like, all right, fine. It's not a big deal. I can get more blood crystals. And it wound up unlocking double jump. And then I picked another one and it unlocked the kind of air dash thing where you could, shoot yourself through the air. And then, yeah, it like I said, it was one of those things where it was a no-brainer to me once I figured out what the foot baths did. They were a large investment, but by getting them, you were able to get to so many different other places.
Yeah. I believe that sometimes this can add a bit of difficulty with what first Jonas was describing, to have this the objectives not as clearly defined, not as easy to be defined, even if you're not battling monsters. Well, part of the difficulty is that it's not so obvious sometimes how to get every part of the evidence. That can be counterbalanced by what you described, Bobcat, these skills. Yeah. Maybe, fortunately, with you, you were able to acquire those skills unexpectedly and easily, and that maybe did somewhat easier your playthrough. In contrast, for example, with mine, I couldn't get those skills. Even in the last call, you described that those skills were very useful. And because you described that those existed, I was so tempted to Google how to get those. But I said to myself, well, if Bobcat found them, and I believe he found them playing regularly, I can also do that. I will ask myself to unlock those, and I couldn't. I never thought about paying that bath. So maybe it is a bit, let's say, haphazard currently how the game may be balanced. There was one small hint for me, at least. I linked it in my headcanon about why it was this chaotic. I'm not sure if you got that dialogue with the architect, but she described that there was one reason for the current architecture of the island. Do you recall it? No worries, I can tell you because it is somewhat fresh for me. She said that so many places, usually high function, they will have, I don't know, the wires in order to turn on something, and they will be hidden below the ground or somewhere else. And she says she's trying to do the opposite. She tries to be very upfront about the function, because the function by itself can create a more honest form. That is more or less a school of thought in level design, and I believe that there is something related about some kind of architecture. I don't know much about architecture. And supposedly in level design, one of the effects, if you are very upfront about the functions of your level design, the problem with that is that if you don't cover it up enough with user experience, with a layer of approachability, as Jonas was describing, of making it easy, the effect is that you can have something very raw and distinct, but also very chaotic. Minecraft had some of that at the earliest times. I believe it has still this kind of vibe. Everything is utilitarian and usable and can be jarring on the first go, while other games are aesthetically so pleasing, like, for example, Fall Guys, where everything is harmonically made, but so much that there is no layer of identity, supposedly, because of that.
Yeah, well, and like, this is a game that I worry sometimes falls into the trap of thinking that it's almost more difficult than it is, or having having a lot of solutions to a problem that isn't necessarily that hard, as I've heard it put before. I think in the context of that was actually somebody talking about Metal Gear Solid, and how they give you all these different tools and all different gadgets and things like that to sneak around people or to take out guards or things like that. And in the end, all you have to do is throw an empty magazine, wait for them to walk away, and you can sneak past and do whatever you need to do. And I think that it can be really interesting and fun for the player, but it can also wind up being an awful lot of effort for something that's not necessarily going to enhance or enrich the experience.
Not a lot of payoff.
Yeah. You know, and so like it's fun to mess around and experiment with the world, but if it's not going to reward you other than giving you either a different solution or just making it slightly easier to do things, how much payoff are you actually getting? And in this game, like I said, I think that was one of the issues I had, was that meditation mechanic just so completely breaking the game, and then having the movement and traversal systems where you don't need the double jump to get much of anything. You don't need the air dash, but it makes certain things which would have been a challenge trivially easy.
Definitely, yeah. I even enjoyed that I had to choose my jumps carefully without that skill. I can imagine how you would lose some of the suspense because of that.
Yeah, well, I mentioned in the Opulent Ziggurat, I didn't know that the bridge thing was actually a puzzle. I just jumped on past them.
You mentioned it, yeah, and oh my god, I spent some time. It is a shame that Iro is not here, but that part of the game had me like this, so tense, because I enjoy the cigarettes, the real-life cigarettes of Mesopotamia. If I recall correctly, that's where the citizens are sacrificed, correct?
Yes.
Like all of the citizens. So
that's where the slaughter and ritual takes place.
Yeah. So by having this real temple that I always enjoy because I adore history, and this whole island was massacred there, and I spent a long time trying to solve that puzzle. I was tense. Even if the puzzle itself wasn't that difficult, I was tense being surrounded by so much blood.
Yeah, there's so much blood in that area. It's very unsettling.
Indeed. And yet with palm trees.
What's weird is that I got really desensitized to the blood pretty quickly. I don't know what it is, but at a certain point I was just like, oh, that's just currency. Or, oh, that's that. Like, I don't know if it's just me, but my brain adjusted very quickly to that.
Wait, you're telling me all that blood is going to turn into blood crystals one day?
Maybe, I don't know. Like, I think something that's interesting is I don't get spooked by horror games very easily, and that's because it's very easy for them to fall into the trap of just being what we see in action games. The difference between an action game and a horror game is oftentimes not the content, it's the presentation and the themes. Because you see increasingly gory things, you see increasingly bloody things in just a regular old shooter. And so that I don't think particularly scared me because there wasn't the atmosphere there to back that up. You have this, upbeat music playing in the background. Everything is very bright and colorful and well lit. And so it's kind of interesting how those things can take what would otherwise be a completely horrific scene, and at least for some players, it negates that entirely.
I believe that is also one reason that this game, with so many beautiful, fun options of titles out there, is distinct. It has this very fun exterior with such a messed up society behind it. And also this freshness in how it approaches storytelling. As we have already described, we don't have one... While there was one murder, and there are not that many actions happening, there are no branching storylines. There are just different solutions according to how you decide to link the events. That is so very, very interesting. I really appreciate that the developers made a very well integrated system instead of an expensively box of assets, as can happen with so many titles in open worlds, for example. The news that I was describing before our call was that fortunately this studio got a round of investment from Kowloon Knights. So right now there is this sensation that storytelling could be different and more interesting. These are one of the investors betting on that. I am happy to hear that they invested in this studio. They have also now supported the studio behind I'm forgetting the name of the game. The one about ghosts in the island of some teenagers. I'm forgetting the name. Anyway, no worries. But I like that not only are we having this fresh perspective in games, but fortunately that there's player interested and investors interested. With all of these things aligned, we can have more titles like this.
Yeah, I think one of the I've talked about this with one of my friends before about
Oxenfree. Sorry, I remember the game.
Oh, Oxenfree, yeah. I talked about this before with one of my friends about how in the kind of like mid to late 2000s, the pursuit was for cinematic games. They would always throw around that word cinematic. And what wound up happening was the intent was you're taking games and you're creating very emotional attachment based on these visuals. What wound up happening was a bunch of long cutscenes breaking up the action. And so, like, people would talk about the games were cinematic because they would use cinematic camera angles, or because they would be presented in like letterbox whenever you had your cutscenes going on. And I think that what we're seeing is a movement away from that and into embracing what games do well, which is blending that interactivity with the story. And I think that you see that with Paradise Killer in that you have to make these deductions. The game is not going to make them for you. You don't get objective markers. You don't get this or that. It shows you kind of generally where to find all the clues. But I like the fact that it relies upon you to create the case that's being built. And I think that it's, in a way, it's almost sort of that anti-cinematic quality, because it's more like a choose your own adventure book. It's getting back to the roots of actually letting the player engage with the game instead of just presenting a game to them.
Totally agree.
Yeah, I play a lot of visual novels, just in general. It's something that I'm really, really into. So seeing them become more of a popular genre and getting more of them released makes me super, super jazzed. So that's a huge, huge positive thing. And I don't know if you guys have heard of the game Death Come True.
I'm afraid not.
It is also a visual novel, but it's an FMV visual novel. Like, everything uses real actors, and it's amazing. And so, like, seeing that kind of game come out, it came out last year, and it was actually I put it on my Game of the Year list. But I'm seeing a lot more creativity in what you can do, and I agree with you completely that there is a shift back to what can we do that's very unique to games.
If you can share that link to that game so that we can maybe take a look in the future.
Yeah. And to be clear, like, I'm not totally down on cinematic games. One of my favorite video game franchises of all time is Metal Gear Solid, a franchise known for 90-minute cutscenes. And that's fine. It works for that game. But I like that sense of moving back toward player agency. And also, like, Half-Life 2 did this back in 2004, the idea of kind of reducing the number of cutscenes, at least like pre-rendered cutscenes, and instead putting the player more into the action. In the case of Half-Life, you didn't really have any interaction or influence on the story, but you were constantly immersed instead of being drawn out of the experience by, you know, having a long, lengthy cutscene where you're seeing your character in third person. It's something that, and here's my hot take, I really don't like The Last of Us or a lot of the PlayStation exclusive narrative focused games, because I think that they do a lot more of that as opposed to trying to integrate the player. It's something that I feel like I'm watching a mini series as opposed to watching, you know, gameplay unfold.
We're going to have so many ways, fortunately, to tell stories. I am more of somewhere between BioShock, that doesn't have these cutscenes that interrupt gameplay, and something like Paradise Killer, where, oh my god, it's mostly text, but such an amazing text. And the game industry is so big that we can have all of these different ways to approach storytelling happening at the same time and being commercially successful. I wonder, it is exciting to see what will happen. In movies, for example, there was this consolidation. While the medium allows you to have, let's say, long feature films and shorts, shorts have mostly lost that fight in terms of how many people pay for shorts. They are sadly something that few people just pay for it, and so it is such a small supply for that. While it is a completely valid way to tell stories in a different way. So in the sense of what people pay for and what therefore gets discovered, and you can get more entries like that, maybe we can tackle another thing that I know so many of you enjoy having hot takes, and that is, what would be the genre for this game? How can we discover this game? Who would like to start?
You just love starting an argument, don't you?
Oh, you have so many good thoughts.
I don't think there is one as we would have traditionally defined it.
We're in the Mexican standoff of discussions.
Cards on the table, I'm very much an advocate for the idea that there is no objective sense of genre, because most game developers do not go in with the purpose of creating X type of game or whatever. They make the games they want to make, and genre is applied later. And in the case of Paradise Killer, I think that that's a very abundantly clear thing, to me at least. It blends visual novels with investigative gameplay and with, in some cases, 3D platforming and things like that in a way that I think it creates something entirely new that can't really be pinned down into a particular genre.
But what would you describe if you had to use a term for this game?
So again, a secondary thing is I also don't believe in using mechanics solely to define genre. And in fact, I think many games defy classification by mechanic. So I would say it's a murder mystery game, which is not a genre that's particularly helpful to most people because that could be just about anything, that doesn't describe how you interact with the game. But I don't think that you necessarily can pin that down.
But it definitely helps. I mean, all of us who have played it, we would never question that it is a murder mystery. And more.
Right.
Do you guys have thoughts about this?
I have no comment.
Oh, come on.
I think you could put it under an umbrella of like adventure type genre, if you will, because it has elements of visual novel. It has elements of like a point and click. It has elements of the 3D platforming. I think if you're going to try and put it into any kind of box, adventure is just a box that is vague enough that can cover any of that. Yeah,
for me, adventure games are the alternative rock of games. So ample, so undefined. What about you, Jonas? How would you find this on Reddit?
I have no idea. I don't have much experience with these kind of games, and the last game that I played that was similar to this was probably like some kind of dating flash game from when I was a kid or something. But on genres, I think that like I mentioned before, I think that this genres will become clear in retrospect, and people will often point at like games that sort of just branches off like noticeably, and then if more games sort of branch off, then it becomes, and people get pins term on it, right? So and within this, it's just really slow because there's like no attention to this, and so like battle what's called battle royale games, they get a name like that, right? Because everybody, like, you got a million people playing it. But with these kind of games, it's really hard to really pin a name on them. And I see this like I remember the game Space Cam, and it really stood out. And the whole point about that game is that it's just a open-ended puzzle, right? There's no fixed puzzles. It's just like and people are like, that's kind of novel, but there's still no name for it, right? It's just an interesting indie game. And those guys are still just making that same kind of indie, and maybe with enough time, maybe we'll get some name for it. I don't know.
Eventually, I agree with you, Jonas. There comes a critical mass of players that position the terms that allow us to have something to at least describe, and everyone more or less understanding what do we mean by a kind of title. That's why when we get the questions by so many of you guys about how to more clearly and I don't know exactly describe, analyze our games in terms of formal elements, I enjoy that kind of conversation, but I know that what eventually wins is the commercial pressure. So something in between, for example, between the rigorous formal elements and the market trends for us developers is what Chris Zukowski coined as anchors and hooks. Maybe I can describe to you a bit that it is very self-explanatory, but a hook is what distinguishes, I am reading him, a hook is what distinguishes your game from the rest. For example, in Superhot, you have an FPS where time moves when you move. Or in This War of Mine, not everyone is a soldier. I like that one quite a lot. While the anchor is a factor that makes your game familiar or safe to your target audience. It is the thing that reduces risk in their mind. So while the hook is what makes your game unique, and maybe there is this element like you described, Bobcat, there are quite a few different things in Paradise Killer that would not be experienced by just describing it as a murder mystery. Well, the murder mystery is perhaps the anchor. That definitely sets something familiar for everyone.
Well, so, I mean, if you want to get into genre theory, my personal position on it is when we're talking about books or movies, we're usually talking about one of three things when it comes to genre. We're talking about the theme, which is, just kind of the overall sort of attitude or message of whatever you're doing. The emotional response, so it could be something like comedy or drama or whatever, and then the setting. And the thing is, you can have any of those three. You can have you can mix and match them. You don't need to have all of them. You can have a comedy sci-fi film where now all of a sudden you're talking about the theme and you're talking about the setting. And I think that what's interesting is that whenever we start getting into games analysis, all of a sudden people want to discard that and instead talk solely about the mechanics. And the thing is, we don't do that with any other medium. We don't talk about the cinematography of a film in the genre of it. We can talk about that and analyze it, but it's not treated with the same importance that gameplay is. And while I recognize and understand that video games are an interactive medium, and that therefore you're going to have that extra layer, I'm okay with applying that extra layer in a sense to your three main things, but I don't think that they should be overriding factors that completely discard those other things. Like in the case of Paradise Killer, the reason why I would say it's a murder mystery and not address the gameplay is because the gameplay is so different and unique, and the other thing is the gameplay isn't the focus that you are there for. It's not the feature that you picked up Paradise Killer for in most cases. What you're picking it up for is the mystery and the story. And we see that with horror games. I've said before that horror breaks genre. It completely destroys it because there are no central defined mechanics of horror. Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Silent Hill, even these small indie games that are just point and click adventures, they're all horror games, but they all play fundamentally differently, and you can't pin down that mechanic. And that's why I don't think that mechanics are particularly useful in defining genre if you're going to try and, as I think the purpose of genre is to recommend similar games. Mechanics do not always indicate that. Yeah. Somebody who's a fan of Call of Duty might not like Resident Evil 7 despite the fact that they play mechanically similar.
Indeed. That's why we have this multi-layer way to describe games. And you mentioned something that suddenly got me thinking about why, as you said, we do not include in our description of movies the cinematography, for example. Suddenly, I wonder if that may be in part because of the consolidation that I described. Film has been so consolidated. I believe that if we had, like in games like shorts and feature movies, and we also had, there were these crazy formats in the history of film that sadly did not pan out. For example, you would have a central movie here and two different things like in different screens over here and over here. And it has its own name. I don't recall what the name of that was. But since these formats lost the commercial war, we don't need words in order to say, oh, by the way, and this drama is a feature film in 2 hours, because most movies are that way. While in games, perhaps, we do need sometimes to describe the mechanics, at least players use it, because fortunately games have mechanics that are so varied. There will never be, I believe, in our medium, the kind of consolidation that happened in movies.
Well, and to be clear, I'm not suggesting that you can't use mechanics to define genre, because I think that it's a useful tool whenever we're describing, for example, more action-oriented things. Calling something a first-person shooter, most players are going to understand what that means. It's going to be a real-time game, focus on ranged combat, things like that. But I think that where that starts to break down is, again, with games where the focus is on the themes and the story, as opposed to on the individual actions that the player is taking. And I think the other reason why I object to those mechanical terms is because they're not always particularly useful or well-defined. An example that I bring up is in the game Sam & Max. It's real-time. You have access to a gun in order to solve puzzles. You, in fact, have puzzles which involve shooting things. Is Sam & Max considered a shooter? Well, no, of course not. It's a point and click. But if you think about it, most shooters are point and clicks. They're fast paced. You have a very simple puzzle, which is to click on the bad guy and the bad guy falls down. But when you start trying to look at what differentiates these, it's not going to be the mechanics. It's going to be the themes, and it's going to be the intention of what's going on. And that's why I don't think that it's necessarily the most useful or productive way of going about things to just try to pin things down in terms of mechanics.
Definitely. In games where mechanics have this backseat, like in Paradise Killer, that's totally the case. I agree.
Yeah.
In academia, and taking benefit of having you here, is this, I don't know, a big discussion, since you have so many kinds of experts in the academic world? Do you have to, in order to analyze a game, first describe a lot what kind of game this is, in what context it is, because not all academics know games in such a profound way?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. And usually when it comes to anything in academic writing, the like rule for it would be to write like the person knows absolutely nothing about what you're talking about, because that's often the case, that they have no idea what you're talking about. So whenever I am having to describe a game when I'm writing, I will go in depth. Like with the J.J. Macfield paper I wrote, a good portion of it is dedicated to this is what the story is, and this is how it plays mechanically. Because both of those elements are important to my argument that I'm making. And so like there are several pages just dedicated to the buildup of where I'm going with this.
Wow.
And like in my book itself, I was having to describe some of the more risque games that came out in the 80s. And again, you have to act like people have no idea what those games were. Like most people don't know what a game called Beat 'em and Eat 'em actually is. So if you, in my book, I had to describe like, this is what the gameplay is, and this is what you're supposed to do in this game. So you always do have to over-explain these kinds of things, especially if you're writing to an audience that may not necessarily know what is going on.
Of course. In that sense, would it be helpful for you to have something like a press kit that can probably help somewhat, but for academics, for an academic audience? We had that experience with Comic-Con where we had to prepare a press kit. And it was fascinating to us that that is a big hurdle for games. Naturally, when you're a AAA game, well, you have so many people in charge of that. Well, with us, I was kind of trying to finish writing the game while also preparing the press kit, well. And it was an idea that I had at some point, that what if I could prepare like descriptions of the game, like it happens in the news, for different audiences. So you have more or less, this is almost an already ready abstract, or marco teórico, it's called in Spanish, a theoretical framework, I believe. So that the game can become approachable for academics who may be interested, as well as naturally some complementary keys. Because I have heard that that is super important in the academic space, and there is no automated way for you guys to get those yet.
That's actually a good point. And, you know, a lot of academic journal papers will have an abstract of like, this is what I'm going to talk about. It's like a paragraph. And so having that with a game would actually make things pretty easy, because then you could just reference that whenever you're talking about the game itself, instead of, you know, my method was I have to look at the box art, I have to look at the gameplay, I have to look at the advertising, and I had to piece together everything to make a cohesive story of what this game was, so that I could then analyze it.
Definitely. It is something very similar on the side with consumers, because you really have to, if you want to have a commercially successful game, you also have to make sure that the screenshots, for example, describe what Bobcat suggested. If it's a mechanically heavy game, well, the mechanics have to be almost immediately understood from the very first screenshot. Well, if it's this kind of game, you don't. If you enter into the game's Steam store page, you don't get that much of a sensation of the mechanics because of the screenshots, and you don't need it. So I believe that there is an opportunity there, at least if more academics would get interested in some games, to have this kind of press kit tool for academics. There has been a colleague, a developer, who did that for indies. I believe it's actually called that way, press kit for indies. And I believe something interesting could be for you guys if we get more indie developers or more academics who tell us exactly what you guys need.
Make my job easier, that's for sure.
And we're all for that.
Especially like now that I'm moving into more recent history as opposed to looking distinctly at the 70s and 80s. Like my current project is looking at something that came out in 1999 and 2000. So I'm still having to do a lot of the piecing together, but as we keep moving along, the more evidence that's left behind of what this is, especially from a game preservation standpoint, you know, if the game itself can't play anymore, if you can't play it on the hardware, at least there is some kind of press kit of saying like, this is what this was.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's at least some kind of impact and imprint left of that game, even if it's not playable anymore.
Yeah. Since our players, fortunately, as you can see, are very sophisticated, I believe in story-driven games in general, there's this attraction for more sophisticated players who want these sophisticated ideas. Sometimes I see that this could benefit everyone. If you have academics who can more easily study, access games, therefore probably will get more work done on the games that may not be as commercially huge, but are sharing some interesting ideas, like this War of Mine that we were describing, this very title, Paradise Killer. Although fortunately I believe Paradise Killer and this War of Mine are also commercially successful, but they have so much to talk about and analyze as well. So maybe we can grab this one up. I thank you everyone for being here, and we get to choose a new game. We have described a few titles here already. You can share those on Games Analysis so that we can vote on the next one. I look forward to it. It was a really cool change of gears from the pathologic grim scenario. This one had a lot of grim stuff, but at least it was sugar-coated. So see you guys around. Have a great Sunday.
Yep.
Bye.
See ya.